For activity 3, we're going to have an Edpuzzle lecture that takes the content from chapters 2, 3, and 4 and starts putting it into the context of this larger idea of information processing. And so by the end of test 2, we are going to have gone through and built this entire concept of information processing that starts with our sensory organs detecting energies, and then ends with us creating long-term memories in our brain that we can then use and recall in our everyday life. And so this is a whittled down model here of the more specific and often competing models that you'll read about in your book. And I really want us to get a general understanding for how we as humans take in information and process it, and where and when information is filtered out and lost along the way. And so for our Edpuzzle today, we're going to start with the first half of this. And so we're going to add in some additional information from what we read about in the book to really put in the beginning of this information processing into context. And we'll talk a little bit beginning of this lecture about sensation being sensory input and this brief sensory memory. So that's in addition to stuff that you read about in your book. We will then generally cover this idea of perception and attention and how it fits into this broader model of information processing. And so focusing on the first half of that model, we're going to start with sensory input, or as we would call sensation. And so this is the very first step in information processing, where our sensing organs, we have 5 of them, right? We have our skin, nose, taste buds, ears, and eyes. Someone argued there's a 6th one, but that's beyond this discussion. So each of those is equipped with nerve cells and neurons that detect certain types of physical energies. And if those energies are strong enough or important enough, what will happen is those nerve cells will send a sensory code, as we're going to call it, up to the brain and activate that specific part of the brain so that the brain can process it and use that sensory code. But not all energies that are detected by the sensing organs are transmitted into sensory codes and sent up to the brain. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in our environment that doesn't get noticed or activated to be used in our brain. And that's because there's a lot that's going on and not all of it is particularly important. And so we have 2 filters at this very first level here of information processing that make sure that we are only sending information up to the brain that is important and needs to be attended to. And so this first filter is this idea of an absolute threshold. And so the absolute threshold is like the minimum strength of that energy that is needed to be turned into a sensory code and sent up to the brain. And so some things that aren't strong enough or salient enough or abundant enough aren't even registered in the brain. And so across all of our different senses, we can think about this absolute threshold a little differently. And so thinking about vision, the absolute threshold would be the smallest level or number of photons or light particles that it takes for us to detect light, right? And so there has to be enough light particles for us to be able to sense light. If there's not, then our brain doesn't even register it, okay? As far as hearing goes, that would be like the lowest or the softest level of sound that it would take for us to notice it. Or it could be the highest frequency or the lowest frequency that we would be able to notice. And so if it doesn't reach that absolute threshold, our nerve cells are not going to code it and send it up to the brain for activation. So it's as if it didn't even happen. So for instance, for sound, we know that if we were to compare ourselves to dogs, we have very different absolute thresholds for frequencies, right? And even ages and people, we know that younger people have a different absolute threshold for frequency, and that they can actually hear lower frequencies than adults can. If we were to think about something like smell, the absolute threshold would be the minimum level of concentrations for like those scent particles that it would take for us to notice a scent. And touch would be like the softest amount of, the least amount of pressure that it would take for us to notice that we're being touched on the skin somewhere. And so these absolute thresholds just go to make sure that not everything that's happening in our world turns into brain activation in us. This idea of absolute difference is that as soon as we activate a sensory code up in the brain, if that stimuli is unchanging, eventually it will stop activating. And our brain will only send up a new activation to be used if something changes. So for instance, this is best explained with an example. Everyone's house has a particular smell, right? And after a while, you get so used to the smell in your house that you can literally no longer notice it anymore. And that's because that particular aroma and scent particles are unchanging to you. And so your brain habituates to it and stops sending sensory codes up to your brain to be registered. And so you're literally not even processing the smell anymore. Someone who comes into your house for the first time and that smell is new will detect that smell, develop sensory codes and send up to the brain for activation. And so they'll be able to notice it. So there's like a Febreze commercial that calls it smell blind or something like that. That's the idea between absolute difference. So after our sensory input, certain energies are coded and sent up to the brain. And we have this idea of sensory memory. And so every sensory code goes up to the brain and activates specific neurons in specific regions. But that activation will last and kind of stay lit up for a few milliseconds or a few seconds so that our brain has time to do things with it. And so this sensory memory isn't so much a memory per se, but what it is just the idea that those neurons and that firing and activation will linger and continue for a few milliseconds or a few seconds. And this allows for activations of different sensory codes to overlap just a little bit. And so they end up being a stream. And so we can connect everything together into a continuous stream of reality without having to have lots of different little snippets of information. And so we need them to overlap for us to put things together. And so there are two main types of sensory memory that we talk about. And the first is iconic memory. And so that is the lingering activation for visual information. And since there is so much visual information in our world and we have to process it so quickly, our sensory memory for this is pretty short. It's 100 milliseconds long. But even though that seems so brief, there is still a way for us to see this in everyday life. And one good example that always can stick out in your head is this idea of waving a sparkler around in the air really quickly. And so when you do that, you get this perception of a light trail behind the sparkler. So your kid might like write their name with the sparkler because they can see the trail of light. And so from where the sparkler was 50 milliseconds ago or 100 milliseconds ago, because that sensory code in the brain is still activated, you can still kind of perceive it. And so this is essentially a picture of that iconic sensory memory, and that even though the sparkler is no longer there, you can still see the light in the sensory code from when it was there, as long as it's within 100 milliseconds. This also allows us to perceive and experience this idea of TV and video games and things that are essentially a lot of still pictures put together and run together so quickly that we perceive it to be one continuous stream of events. And so I'm going to play this 4-minute TED Talk really quick so you don't have to listen to me for 5 minutes, and going to show you what I mean.
Take a series of still, sequential images. Let's look at them one by one. Faster. Now let's remove the gaps. Go faster still. Wait for it. Bam! Motion. Why is that? Intellectually, we know we're just looking at a series of still images, But when we see them change fast enough, they produce the optical illusion of appearing as a single, persistent image that's gradually changing form and position. This effect is the basis for all motion picture technology, from our LED screens of today to their 20th century cathode ray forebears, from cinematic film projection to the novelty toy, even, it's been suggested, all the way back to the Stone Age when humans began painting on cave walls. This phenomenon of perceiving apparent motion in successive images is due to a characteristic of human perception historically referred to as persistence of vision. The term is attributed to the English-Swiss physicist Peter Marc Roget, who in the early 19th century used it to describe a particular defect of the eye that resulted in a moving object appearing to be still when it reached a certain speed. Not long after, the term was applied to describe the opposite, the apparent motion of still images, by Belgian physicist Joseph Plateau, inventor of the phenakistoscope. He defined persistence of vision as the result of successive after-images which were retained and then combined in the retina, making us believe that what we're seeing is a single object in motion. This explanation was widely accepted in the decades to follow and up through the turn of the 20th century, when some began to question what was physiologically going on. In 1912, German psychologist Max Wertheimer outlined the basic primary stages of apparent motion using simple optical illusions. These experiments led him to conclude the phenomena was due to processes which lie behind the retina. In 1915, Hugo Münsterberg, a German-American pioneer in applied psychology, also suggested that the apparent motion of successive images is not due to their being retained in the eye, but is superadded by the action of the mind. In the century to follow, experiments by physiologists have pretty much confirmed their conclusions. As it relates to the illusion of motion pictures, persistence of vision has less to do with vision itself than how it's interpreted in the brain. Research has shown that different aspects of what the eye sees, like form, color, depth, and motion, are transmitted to different areas of the visual cortex via different pathways from the retina. It's the continuous interaction of various computations in the visual cortex that stitch those different aspects together and culminate in the perception. Our brains are constantly working, synchronizing what we see, hear, smell, and touch into meaningful experience in the moment-to-moment flow of the present. So in order to create the illusion of motion in successive images, we need to get the timing of our intervals close to the speed at which our brains process the present. So how fast is the present happening according to our brains? Well, we can get an idea by measuring how fast the images need to be changing for the illusion to work. Let's see if we can figure it out by repeating our experiment. Here's the sequence, presented at a rate of 1 frame per 2 seconds, with 1 second of black in between. At this rate of change, with the blank space separating the images, there's no real motion perceptible. As we lessen the duration of blank space, the slight change in position becomes more apparent, and we start to get an inkling of a sense of motion between the disparate frames. 1 frame per second. 2 frames per second. 4 frames per second. Now we're starting to get a feeling of motion, but it's really not very smooth. We're still aware of the fact that we're looking at separate images. Let's speed up. 8 frames per second. 12 frames per second. Looks like we're about there. At 24 frames per second, the motion looks even smoother. This is standard full speed. So the point at which we lose awareness of the intervals and begin to see apparent motion seems to kick in at around 8 to 12 frames per second. This is in the neighborhood of what science has determined to be the general threshold of our awareness of seeing separate images. Generally speaking, we begin to lose that awareness at intervals of around 100 milliseconds per image, which is equal to a frame rate of around 10 frames per second. As the frame rate increases, we lose awareness of the intervals completely and are all the more convinced of the reality of the illusion.
So the point of showing you the rate of how fast images have to be changing for us to no longer detect the difference is an example of iconic memory. And you can also think of why might iconic memory also explain when we look at a fan that's on high and we can no longer see the blades moving. How might that be explained by iconic memory? Well, beyond iconic memory, we also have echoic memory, which by the clip art, you can probably assume is the continued activation in the brain of auditory information. And now, just because of the difference in nature between visual information and auditory information, how much there is and how quickly it changes, the memory for this, sensory memory for this is much longer. This is all the way to 4 seconds. And this is a holding tank, you can think of it as, where sounds are held. Remember, it's this activation in the brain that lingers for up to 4 seconds so that it can overlap with the activation that came before it and the activation that comes after it. And this allows us to process all of these sounds together so we can put them together into continuous streams. And this is what makes it possible for us to understand speech and for us to enjoy things like music. Otherwise, each individual sound would be on its own. And so we have, let's get caught up in this information processing model real quick. Starting at the beginning, we have sensations. If they are strong enough or they change, they get coded and sent up to the brain for activation. Depending on the type of sensation and information it was, it gets activated in certain parts of the brain, and it will stay active for some milliseconds up to seconds. And then we have all of this kind of random scattering and changing activation in the brain. And then it is our brain's job to put all of that information together into shapes and forms and patterns and perceptions of reality that make sense. And so this is the process and the idea of perception, and that it puts together and interprets all of this sensory info that's active in our sensory memory or in the brain. So I want to start building this idea of perception being constructed. It's constructive and it's constructed. So I'm utilizing a picture of a crane here just to really send home the message that our brain is building our perception of reality using several different building blocks, right? And so we read about this in the book, but the first idea is these sensory codes. So it's the literal activation of certain neurons in the brain, and that is our bottom-up processing. So it's taking all of that activation in the brain and it's combining it or using our top-down processing, which essentially is just our prior knowledge. But more specifically, it will include things like our previous experiences, everything that's ever happened, our personal beliefs, our needs at the time and in general, our expectations, biases, and knowledge that we have. And so it uses all of this information to interpret the sensory codes and put them together. And so I have this picture of the resulting perception or our mental model of external events, our reality, what's going on around us, as being purple, because it's a combination of these two things. And so our top-down prior knowledge is coloring and dictating the way that our brain puts together all of these sensory codes. And so one of the most important ideas behind perception, not only is that it's constructed, but that it's subjective, because this top-down prior knowledge is different across everyone. And so this two processes of top-down and bottom-up processing are both complementary and competing. And so where one is lacking, the other can compensate and vice versa. So for instance, you might have seen one of these little jumbled passages online or somewhere previously. The idea is that in each word, the first and the last letter are correct, and the letters in the middle are jumbled. And so what we're doing here is we are compensating with our top-down knowledge about word segmentation, spelling, what words go together, and the context. All of the knowledge that we have about the English language is compensating for the lack or the confusing bottom-up sensory info that's being presented here. And so we can use this to read this even though each and every word except for do is misspelled. And so do you find this simple to read? Because of the phenomenal power of the human mind, most people do. And so this is where top-down knowledge can really come in handy. In other instances, our top-down knowledge might cause a misperception. And so for instance, take the situation of an accidental shooting while hunting, right? And so when you're in the woods and you're paying close attention and you're hunting, I don't hunt, but this is what I understand the situation would be in this case. You would be looking at the scenery and just waiting for movement or something to change, right? And as soon as you do, you would be prepared to shoot. So your expectation as a hunter being in this situation would be that animals are going to be in the woods, right? So motion that you would see you would expect it to be an animal. And so perhaps if there's a person that's in the woods that's not wearing reflective gear that would really point them out as a person, if you see something moving, you might shoot it, and it could accidentally be a person. Now, the idea behind this is that the bottom-up info coming in, all these signals that are being detected by the retina and activated by the brain would be telling you that that's a person. People don't look like deer, right? But your expectations and top-down knowledge are overshadowing your perception of the situation so much that at first you might perceive or assume that that motion indicates an animal. Anyways, this is an example of how your expectations about a scene could really color and cause an initial misperception. And so usually our perception is pretty accurate. We don't live in la la land. We know what's going on around us most of the time, but there are these instances and they're not uncommon. And we can utilize things like optical illusions or other types of situations where the context might lead you to have a misperception. And we'll talk about more applied scenarios of this in the future when we get to things like false memories. So here is a common, I don't even know if I would venture to call this an optical illusion, but it is listed in your book, and it's a classic example of how just manipulating some of the details of a picture can really change the perception of the figure as a whole. And so here the claim is that these tables are the same. One is just rotated with the legs further out towards the end. And so the claim is that the surface area, that these tables are the same size. Now I put this in the PowerPoint and I could swear that it was wrong. I really didn't think that, let me start my video so you guys can see. Hopefully you can see me. I really was gonna try to call BS on this. And so I printed it out to prove it to myself and also to show you guys. I printed it out and I cut out the long table. And I was like, there's no way it's gonna fit, but it does, y'all. It fits perfectly on the other one. So I had to prove this to myself, but this really just goes to show how some of the assumptions that your bottom-up processing is making can be overruled or not overruled by top-down possession. And so it can cause these misperceptions. So going back to this idea of perception being constructed, we know that the top-down building blocks, our prior knowledge and experiences and expectations, vary from person to person. And because of that, the perception of the very same stimuli can also vary, which is illustrated by this cute little cartoon. We can also alter your perception of an object or a figure simply by changing your expectations, simply by immediately changing your top-down processing of that picture. And so if I were to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well is this duck drawn? Well, since I colored your top-down perception of this to be a duck with my question, you would see a duck. But if I were to change your expectation for what this picture is supposed to be and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you enjoy this picture of the rabbit? Immediately your perception should change. And so that you're seeing this picture as a rabbit. And you can flip back and forth depending on what your current top-down perception or expectation about what this picture is supposed to be is. So there's a lot of subjectiveness in perception because of our differences in how we top-down process things. But there are also some basic rules that apply to everyone. And so it's great to know these rules because we can kind of leverage these rules when we're working with the visual perception of objects and pictures and things like that. And so these are the Gestalt organizational principles that you read about in your textbook. Oddly enough, your textbook doesn't cover all of them. And these are pretty foundational concepts to the idea of perception and cognitive psychology. And so they're also kind of fun. And so we're just gonna run through them here briefly before we wrap up this ed puzzle. And so this is essentially all of we call them heuristics or these Gestalt principles. And what a heuristic is it's an unconscious inference or a mental shortcut that our brain makes when it's interpreting and putting together these sensory codes into a perception of something. And so just at first glance, your brain makes certain assumptions about visual information according to all of these different heuristics or mental shortcuts, if you will. The first one is proximity. Just look at it. What do you see? You see one group of dots here, and then you see three groups of dots here. Your perception, the difference in your perception is only caused by the proximity of the dots together. So since these have spaces between them, you perceive it to be three different groups of dots instead of one. Pretty simple, but again, just an example of one of those automatic assumptions that your brain does when it's perceiving information. This one's a little confusing since they're all the same color, but the idea is that instead of seeing 10 separate images here, 100, I think, you see a diamond made of circles on top of or in front of a background of diamonds, triangles, excuse me. Same idea here. Instead of seeing all of these separate little shapes, white circles, black circles, half circles, semicircles, all of that, you see what looks to me like a octopus tentacle that is indicated by the white dots overlapping, and it's kind of on top of these black dots. But just when you open your eyes and perceive this image, that is how your brain codes it and interprets it instead of everything separately. This idea of closure and that your brain is going to close the shape for you. So instead of seeing 5 differently angled pentagons here, it's a soccer ball. And instead of seeing some Pac-Man with greater than signs here, you see 2 triangles overlapping with circles behind the top triangle. This good figure idea is that our brain interprets things to be as simple as possible. And so instead of seeing a triangle, 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 sliver, 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 what you perceive is a circle on top of a square because it's simpler. Common fate is this idea that things that look like they are doing the same thing will go together. And so instead of seeing 8 birds, you see a line of geese flying. And here, this could be a couple things. You could perceive each of these to be a group. So these arrows go together and these arrows and these arrows. But my top-down knowledge is coming into play here. And I'm seeing what I imagine to be like a button on an old VCR that has forward, backwards, and like triple fast forward. Good continuation, the simplest illustration of this is just looking at lines. And so it wants lines, your perception wants lines to flow in an easy manner, kind of like a river. And so this would be how you would perceive it, like an X, 2 lines overlapping versus a V and a upside down U. And in real life, good continuation is really our perception that things exist, continue to exist if something is in front of them. So rather than seeing, this is a little baby elephant and it's behind a tree. But if we were to look at this just plainly thinking about our bottom-up processing, this would be an elephant with half a head and then a floating elephant ear, because we don't technically see them connected. But our assumption that's automatically made by our brain is that this is an entire elephant and it continues to exist behind the tree and continue on. Figure ground is a really neat one to think about because your perception of an object completely depends on what you determine the object and the background to be. And so in this example, you could either have a white chalice with a black background, or if you were to make the white part the background, it would be 2 faces facing each other with a white background in between. Similarly, with this example, if the figure was to be the black part, then most people perceive to see like a dude with a big nose and a saxophone or some type of horn. But if you perceive the white part to be the figure, then you see a face with this black as the background. So in nature, camouflage utilizes this because if we are unable to detect the difference between the figure and the background, then we lose our ability to perceive the object completely. And so there is something in this picture. I'll give you a hint in like 20 seconds to find it. It's a snake. So there is a copperhead right in the middle of this picture. Here is the tail, and it kind of makes an S shape around, and then its head is right here. And so this copperhead has you can tell it's copperhead because it has these little Hershey kiss patterns on it. Very good camouflage with the ground, and we cannot even see it until we point it out so that we're able to focus our vision on the actual object. Then and only then can we distinguish it from the background and begin to perceive it. So coming back to the overall idea of perception as a whole, we went over the sensory codes that are activated in the brain, right? We also have some general rules that our bottom-up processing will use to help put things together. We then have our top-down knowledge that's used to make sense of those things and put them together. And it makes our perception of individual stimuli, figures, and even entire situations subjective and different across people. And so that brings us to this idea of attention. We've received energies, we've transmitted them into the brain where they've been activated. We then put all those activations together using our prior knowledge and top-down processing into a perception of reality that makes sense and that we experience. Then what happens is our brain chooses to attend to certain things that are being perceived. And so attention really is just a process of picking things that are being perceived and moving them into our working memory, which is where we actually think about stuff. So think of our working memory, which we'll talk about next week, as being kind of like the desktop on your computer. It's where you actually do stuff, think about stuff, and manipulate information in mind. So attention is this process of picking stuff, certain things from perception, and moving it over there. Now, it's always important to point out in these models as we go through and build it, where we lose information and where we filter out information, because we want to make this as efficient as possible. The less amount of things that we are operating on, activating, and thinking about, the more efficient that we're going to be able to be. So remember that we lose information here at initial sensation by the two thresholds, right? Absolute and difference. Then whatever gets activated, we put together in perception, and then attention is this second stage where we really start to filter things out. Now, your textbook goes through a number of different attention models, and the real difference between those models is at what stage information gets filtered out. Is it late or is it early? That really, in the real world and in today's science, depends on the certain situation and sure could still be argued. But what the most important part to understand about attention is its function and what type of information it selects to bring into working memory. So the whole idea is that attention filters out unimportant information. It is limited. We can only think and attend to so much information at once. And as such, not everything that we perceive is attended to. And so there's a lot of things that you intentionally ignore, and there's a lot of things that you automatically ignore without even thinking about it. And so right now in my office, I come here because there's not a lot of distractions, but my refrigerator motor just came on and it's humming behind me, but I'm not paying attention to it because I got a job to do. I'm also not paying attention to the sensation of my chair on my legs, or the sensation of my glasses sitting on my nose. I'm not paying attention to my phone, which has actually been buzzing next to me because of a really annoying group text I'm on with my family. And so I'm both intentionally and unintentionally filtering out some information that's being perceived, but I'm just not paying attention to it. And so we say that attention is selective. It's literally called selective attention. Some things we select on purpose and some things get selected automatically. So what gets selected? Well, the first thing that you'll probably think about is goal-directed activities. So it's things that we pay attention to on purpose. Right now, hopefully you are paying attention to this lecture on purpose because it is a goal-directed activity. You have the goal of completing this, getting a grade, moving on to the next module item. Okay, so anything that you are intentionally attending to because there's a point is a goal-directed activity. And we do those all day long, unfortunately, sometimes. Also, things that get unintentionally selected and get selected automatically is adaptive and important information. So these kind of sneak through the filter, right? And so what do I mean by adaptive and important information? Well, that means information that we have evolved to automatically pay attention to that may help us reproduce, or it may help keep us alive. Remember that almost all of our evolution was during hunter-gatherer times. And so we really are kind of wired to be living in the wild and in danger. So motion always catches our attention because that could automatically attending to that could help us prevent us from getting eaten by a bear, right? Size, things that are large also automatically get attended to because they might be of more significance or even more threatening. Intensity, so things that are loud, bright, and salient automatically get attended to. Novelty, things that are new. Our brains have an automatic tendency to want to learn. We need to detect what is new in our environment, pay attention to it, and learn about it so that we can react accordingly, right? So anything that's new, and this starts all the way in infancy too. Anything that's novel, we will automatically pay attention to. Things that are surprising, which is related to being novel, usually new things that we haven't seen before are surprising, but something that we wouldn't expect. Social cues. There are so many social cues that we automatically pay attention to that you don't even notice when you're talking and having a conversation with someone. You notice certain physical or cues while you're talking to them, where their eyes are, how their mouth is moving, how their body is positioned, how far away they are from you. Even in groups, you'll notice who's standing with who, where are they standing, what does their conversation sound like, how loud are they speaking. All of these different social cues are very adaptive and important for us as social creatures. There's also other adaptively important information, like anything to do with food, especially if you're hungry. You're not going to be able to ignore the person eating a pizza next to you in class if you're starving. It's just automatically going to sneak through that filter. Or sexual information also sneaks through the filter. So if someone's wearing very revealing clothes, you can't help but notice and perhaps look at that person at first, because that's just something that we're wired to notice and always sneaks through the filter. So these are all the things that get selected. Some we select on purpose, and all this other information comes through the filter automatically because it's important for our survival and success. If not now, then it used to be when we were evolving, and that kind of still lingers in the way that our brains process information. So now we've gone through this entire first half of our information processing model. So you guys should hopefully be able to explain this in your own words, in simpler terms, what each stage does, where information is lost at each stage. Remember, so far we have sensation filtering out a lot of stuff and attention filtering out a lot of stuff. And you should know why our nervous systems filter out and attention filter out this information. Next week, we will begin to talk about working memory, which, as I said, is kind of our mental desktop where we literally think about information.